Thank you all for being here. And for those of you who were here last week, thank you for coming back. This is the Google Partners Academy on Air, Making Your Message Stick with Clients, Part 2. And if you were here for last week, we'll build off some of those fundamentals. If you weren't here last week, no problem at all. You'll be able to easily connect to the fundamentals we'll work on today. There will be a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. So over the course of this discussion, if you have any specific questions, please submit them into the live chat box. I am Adam Shavitz with Accelerate Performance Sales Consulting. Here you see my son, Max, and my adopted daughter, Sadie, wishing you a very happy Valentine's Day week. When I am not playing with one of those pink or red balls with Max, I'm often working with our team to provide coaching to Googlers or to Google partners like all of you so that you are even more effective in your client discussions. My role today is hopefully as a coach for you to provide one or two specific things you can use in your upcoming client or stakeholder conversations. Our team and I have done this type of work at Google with Googlers for the last 10 years, and we've worked with hundreds of partners like you and agencies like you to support you in having even more effective conversations with your audiences. So I know some of you are dying to know which specific topics we are covering today. Yes, it's totally unanimous you want to know, and here is today's agenda. The three specific areas we will cover: number one, how we ask great questions; number two, some specific tips on actually presenting solutions; and number three, how we handle client resistance. So for each one of these topics, with respect to connecting them to making the message stickier, with the first, asking great questions, right? If we ask better questions to our audiences and understand more specifically and more clearly what drives them, we're ultimately able to deliver a more relevant and more resonant message. The second one's kind of obvious. If we present better and more clear solutions, they're obviously more sticky. And the third, the idea behind handling resistance is if we can work with our clients when they have concerns versus against them or at them, we tend to enable our messages to be stickier and more long-lasting. So, by the way, next week's presentation hangout like this is with a Google leader named Jenya. Jenya is going to focus on sharing leadership best practices, and that's a very nice complement. Today's session on client centricity coupled with Jenya's presentation on leading at Google is a good recipe for success for your long-term growth of the organization. Now, regardless of your role, whether your audience is internal or external, we all need to be compelling and more memorable. And when we think about the fundamentals we're going to work on today, I encourage you to think about this logo right here. Now, I'm pretty sure most of you have seen this logo before. And I would suggest that many of you have seen the arrow in the FedEx logo. In fact, if you see the arrow in the FedEx logo, go ahead and raise your hand. And you don't know this, but I can actually see you raising your hand. Thank you for those of you who did that. Now, if you cannot see the arrow in the FedEx logo, please go ahead and raise your hand. It's okay. You're just as perceptive as the others, but you just haven't seen it before, right? So for those of you who don't see the arrow in the FedEx logo, if you look here between the E and the X, you probably see the arrow now. And the point is, whether you saw it before today or today was the first time, when you go out to lunch today or when you leave the office today and you're walking down the street and a FedEx truck rolls by, guess what you're probably going to notice? The arrow. It's always been there, but now you're a little bit more intentional and focused on it. And for the fundamentals we're focused on today, the idea is to be that much more deliberate so that the right version of us shows up. So when we think about our audiences and the meetings we work on, I encourage you to think about what is a more positive experience, buying or selling. Take a look here. What's happening on the left? What's happening on the right? On the left, I believe, looks a little bit more like a sale. And on the right is a happy family who just what? A home. They just bought their home, right? If I go out and get a new car, that I'm really excited about it and I want to tell my friends and family about it? Am I likely to come out and say, hey, check out this great new car that just got sold to me? Or if I had a positive experience and I'm excited about it, I'm probably more likely to say, check out this great new car I just bought, right? So what we're focused on in driving these conversations is creating a positive and unique buying experience. When we do that, our audience is in more control and more likely to participate and act quickly on the ideas and the solutions that we're discussing with them, not pitching at them. So that'll be a key focus throughout today. Now, when we think about asking great questions, one idea I would encourage you to keep in mind is driven from the movie Jerry Maguire. Now, most of you have probably seen the movie, and you remember it's not Show Me the Money. It's the time when Tom Cruise, playing Jerry Maguire, and Rod Tidwell, the character who was played by Cuba Gooding Jr., they're in the bathroom together. And Tom Cruise is pleading. I don't encourage you to plead with your clients, but Tom Cruise is pleading with his client. Help me help you. Help me help you. Help me help you. And again, while I don't encourage groveling, that general approach toward question asking as we move into today's first topic is very important, right? Do I have a red and a blue pen behind my back and I'm asking you questions to figure out which one I can sell you? People can tell if that's what I'm trying to do, and that's not the right intention of asking questions. I want to be asking questions demonstrating my genuine and sincere curiosity. I really want to understand what my audience is trying to accomplish. If that's what I'm doing in my questioning, I tend to be perceived not as a salesperson, but as someone who wants to be a trusted partner and someone who wants to help. That is our overall focus when we're trying to ask questions. So let's take a look at what we call the conversation spectrum, right? So if you look at this carefully, it's not that complicated of a graph here. On the left-hand side, we have 0. That's when you, your team members, your agency colleagues, or yourself, you're talking 100% of the time in the meeting with a client or a stakeholder. And a 10 on this scale is where the client is talking 100% of the time in a meeting. Now, most of your meetings, they will almost never be a 0, and they will almost never be a 10. You'll be somewhere in between here, right? And there's a ton of variables that are involved here, the number of people in the room, the type of meeting it is. But if you were to take the last 1,000 meetings that have happened between some sort of partner or agency and your client or prospective client and say, where are the average of those 1,000 meetings falling in this scale? Most people tend to say we're about in this area. It may not be exactly that 2.5, 3 area, but somewhere in there where we're talking 70, 80% of the time. And then if I were to ask you, where are your best meetings? The top 5 or 10% of those 1,000 meetings, where are they on this scale? Most of us tend to agree that the best meetings are somewhere down here on this scale, more in this 6 or 7 range. Again, there's a ton of variables here, but most of us agree with the general concept. Our better meetings are when we're able to move to the right on this scale. Now, there's a lot of little tactics we'll focus on today that help us intentionally move to the right. One little one, if you're having meetings with your clients where you have slides, by the way, I'm sure you're only using Google Slides and not any other version of slides. But when we're using those slides, by the nature of using those slides, where are you going to be on this scale? Probably a little bit further to the left. Now, it's fine to use slides, but one little thing you can do, I would suggest, is actually putting questions on your slides. Putting questions you want to ask your client on your slides. That will enable you to incrementally and intentionally take steps to the right in this conversation spectrum. Okay, so the main idea between moving to the right is if we plan our questions in advance, we're more likely to ask questions. If we're more likely to ask questions, again, we move to the right more regularly, and a framework helps us prepare the questions we're most likely to ask. So I would encourage you to think of this framework not as something that you need to follow verbatim, but if you have certain buckets of questions, you can help yourself prepare the questions, and again, then you're more likely to ask them. There's a ton of questioning or discovery models out there. They all work. The one that works for you is the one that works for you, and the idea is to make sure you are efficiently able to prepare your questions. My colleagues and I do this all the time. 20 minutes before a meeting, we'll sit down and we'll think about little buckets of questions to ask to help the meeting go the right direction. So the first area of questioning is current situation questions. Not rocket science. We're asking about the present. What is going on now? We'll get into this in a little bit more detail in a few moments. The second area is obviously the desired state. What is our audience trying to accomplish? What does success look like? And some of you are familiar with this term of the selling gap. Sometimes this is referred to as the pain, right? This is the difference between the current state and the desired state. And when you can effectively develop that gap, you've created an opportunity to potentially provide a solution. The third area of questions is expectations questions. Think of the Google Map analogy here, right? In order to use Google Maps effectively, you need to have a current situation, a current location, a desired situation, a future destination. And you know on Google Maps where it says, are you riding a bike? Are you walking? Are you driving your car? Are you taking public transportation? How do you want to get there? That's expectations questions. How do you want me as your agency or partner to work with you best to help you potentially get from your current to desired state? If the buckets make sense so far, we'll get into a little bit more specifics down the line here. The other two areas of questioning are point of view questions and primary motivating factor questions. We'll talk about how these fit in as well, but again, these enhance our question asking approach. Okay. The other thing to think about in your sequence when you're asking questions is what I'd call this hierarchy of topics. And there's not a right or wrong. There's a pay attention to this, just like the arrow in the FedEx. If you look at these topics here, I would suggest in a meeting with a client, you can ask questions about any one of these 5 areas. But my question to you is it easier to move from the bottom up or the top down? Most of us find that it's a lot easier to go from general to specific. If my first couple questions are about specific AdWords strategies, it's harder to take a step back and ask them about their overall business, versus the other sequence tends to be a little bit more logical and easier to navigate the conversation. The other thing to be sensitive of is being perceived as too selfish if you start off with very specific questions. So for example, in my world, I sell sales training and customer service programs. So my clients are often VPs or heads of sales organizations. So if I have a meeting with one of my clients, a VP of sales, and one of my first questions to that particular client is, what are your sales training priorities for 2017? Now, most would argue that's an innocent and appropriate question. But what are your sales training priorities for 2017? What percentage of my professional world is sales training? 98 or 100%. That is my world. That's where I play. For the VP of sales, what percentage of his world or her world is sales training? Maybe 2, 3, 5%. So if I start off with that question, it can be perceived as Adam looking out for Adam's interests here. So I would suggest that running through this framework, I can start out with something more broad. Tell me about your most important priorities in 2017. What are you hearing from your customers? What are the people in your sales organization doing best with customers? What are the conversations you want to see happening more? What types of conversations do the people in your organization need to practice? So I've earned the right to get there, right? I'm asking questions right now about conversations people need to practice. That's a question about sales training. But it was my 5th or 6th question, and I'm able to earn the right to ask about something more relevant to me, more specific to me, once I've started more broadly. So I would encourage you to take a look at the questions you're asking and saying, before I ask selfish questions about my area, have I earned the right to get there? Okay, so we said the first bucket was this current situation bucket. So we're going to go through some examples and give us each the chance to create some questions for ourselves. Now, why do we start with the current situation? The current situation is the present. It's the now. It's easier for our audience to talk about. We want our first questions to get them talking. Is it appropriate for me to ask the question, hey, client or prospective client, give me your 5-year vision for your business? I would suggest that's not an inappropriate question. It's not a great first question because it's tough to answer. It requires a lot of thought. You want your first questions to be easy for them to answer so that they start opening up. A few examples here. Very simple. What are your current priorities? Which parts of your business are the most profitable? What feedback do you hear most often from customers? These are things that are top of mind for most business leaders or the people you're working with. So I would encourage you to take 10 seconds right now. Write down, and you can certainly use one of these questions right here. If not, think about a specific upcoming client meeting or an internal stakeholder, someone you're going to be meeting with later today, tomorrow, early next week. Write their name down on your piece of paper, or you can type it, open up a doc, a Google Doc that is, and write down one first current situation question you want to ask them in your upcoming meeting. It can be one of these, a version of one of these, or you can create another one. Take 10 seconds. Okay. So after current situation, obviously comes the desired situation. This is where we want to get them explaining their vision, describing their ideal future state. In their desired situation, they've already capitalized on opportunities, they've solved problems. So example questions we can ask are here. And again, it really depends on the scope and the topic of your conversation, but we're asking them about the future. So again, for your specific upcoming meeting, take 10 or 15 seconds and write down one question you want to ask about the desired state, about the future. It can certainly be a version of one of these questions, or you can create a new one. Take 10 seconds, please. We've got the current situation, we've got the desired situation. Now the expectations type questions, again, how would you like me to serve you, or how would you like us to potentially serve you? Here are some examples of how that question may go. I'm a big proponent, I ask all the time, question number 3, what's your criteria for selecting the ideal partner? This would be in a new business type context, where if I get a decent answer to that question, obviously, I'm able to emphasize the parts of our solution that are most aligned with their important criteria. So again, take 10 seconds on your own, use a version of one of these questions, or create your own expectation question that you can ask in an upcoming meeting. Take 10 seconds. Point of view questions. These are a version of current situation questions. I played a sport that's growing out here on the West Coast in Google world, more popular on the East Coast, but growing all over the US. I played a sport in college called lacrosse. And over the course of my career, I had some highs and some lows, and I've had to have 3 back surgeries. And don't worry, I'm doing great just now. But a few years back, prior to my 3rd back surgery, as you can imagine, I was pretty careful about which physician I chose to operate on my back. So I met with 4 different physicians. And one meeting with one of the physicians really stood out to me. It was about how he demonstrated credibility with me. So as I was in this physician's office assessing whether he was the right person to put me under and operate on my back, he was looking at my MRI reports and my X-ray reports, and he asked me, he said, Adam, I know you've come in today complaining about back pain on the lower left side of your back. Have you ever felt any pain actually running down the outside of your left leg? And I thought about it for a second, and I said, you know what? I do have that type of pain at times. He said, Adam, looking at your reports, I was wondering, do you ever feel any numbness or tingling in the toes on your left foot? And I said to myself, you know what? And back to the doctor, I do have that sensation at times. So what was actually happening here? By the way, this was the doctor that I selected to operate on my back, and I'm doing pretty well ever since. Well, what was happening in this conversation? I would suggest that this doctor was building significant credibility in this conversation with me. But how was he doing it? He wasn't telling me which medical school he went to. He wasn't telling me that he had operated on 5,000 backs exactly like mine. He was building credibility by asking the right question, demonstrating he had been there before. Remember, the buying dynamic versus the selling dynamic. If you build credibility through questions, you're creating that buying dynamic because I, in this case, the buyer or the audience, was participating in the conversation. So the way that we see this happen most frequently with point of view questions in your world is by sharing some data, a trend, or an insight, and asking what's your point of view or asking for their perspective. Now, there's an important area to try to avoid here. It's very common for you guys to bring in a trend or an insight and think, I got a solution to solve that issue or insight right away. And it's good to have that in mind. But if I want to have a conversation, we need to move from data or insight to question rather than from data or insight to solution right away. So if you look at this example here, the average smartphone user checks his or her phone 150 times per day. So let me tell you about the mobile strategy you should have. No, we want to have a conversation. Share the insight and turn it into a question. How are you thinking about mobile? Of course, I have ideas for your mobile strategy, but I want to help you buy. I don't want to pitch this right at you. And it works with any data, trend, statistic. You guys have thousands of them. The key is to pick the most important 2 or 3 or 4 and turn them into conversations. You see another example here. Right? I could easily say 70% of online shoppers put items in their cart and get distracted and leave before actually buying, so you need to purchase this remarketing solution. But that's a little bit overly aggressive, more toward a pitch. 70% of online shoppers leave with items in the cart when they get distracted. How are you working on that? How does this impact your business? Everyone get it? Good. Think again, back to your specific upcoming situation. Write down one piece of data, a trend, an insight. It can include a number. It doesn't have to include a number, and turn it into a question. The question can almost always be, how are you thinking about this? Take 10 seconds. Trend or insight plus question, please. This is a point of view question. Okay, the last bucket or area of questions is these primary motivating factor questions. Now, for those of you who tuned in last week, the primary motivating factor questions are intended to expose some of those emotional needs, some of those buying motives. So if you've done a good job and you've understood the current situation and you've understood the desired situation, right? So let's say you learned from the current to desired, your audience wants more of a certain type of customer. Your audience wants to improve its conversion rate. Your audience wants to open more stores later this year. Your audience wants to change its perception in the market. Whatever it is, when you hear the difference between where they are and where they want to be, what often goes on in our mind is, I can fix that. And I'm a salesperson and I'm going to jump on it like a hobo on a ham sandwich. And I'm going to suggest that we can be more effective as a trusted partner and consultant by, when we develop the current situation and the desired situation, we understand what they want, we go a bit deeper. In my wife Melissa's sales organization, they call these double-clicking questions, right? We're finding out why. Why now? What will the impact be? What will success truly look like when you get there? Why is that important to your overall business? So as you see, guys, these are pretty simple questions. When you get the difference between where someone is and where someone wants to be, instead of selling right away, try to go 2 or 3 layers deeper. The answers to those questions will likely make your ultimate solution be much more sticky, relevant, and able to address not just the what, but also the why. One little thing to pay attention to, guys, if you look at these 3 questions on the screen now, you'll see they're pretty short. There's something called the paradox of questions, whereby the shorter the question, often the better the answer. And the inverse is true as well. Sometimes we ask a 2-minute long question and we've confused the heck out of our audience and it's hard for them to answer. Shorter questions often yield better results and better answers. It's also important to try to ask one question at a time. Often we ask several at a time and don't get good answers, and we wonder why. Okay, so we're at this point where we've asked good questions, and whether it's later in the same meeting, whether it's 2 weeks later in the next meeting, or whenever it is, we ultimately are going to present our solution. Now, there's tons of ideas we can work on with presenting solutions, so we're going to cover some specific tips that tend to go a long way with some little ideas here. The first is we spend so much time if we're presenting a solution dedicated to our slides, and you can do that. But I would suggest what comes out of your mouth is just as important, if not oftentimes more important, than what's on your slides. So devote some of that time to practicing the words that are coming out of your mouth. And if you have to over-index on practicing a specific portion, please practice the first 1 to 2 minutes of your presentation. When it starts well, it goes well, and you're able to build momentum. Practice aloud. Okay, the next one. Early on when you're pitching, when you're presenting a solution, I would strongly suggest you start by recapping or summarizing their objectives. Earlier when we spoke, or last time we met, you mentioned that this was important, you mentioned that this was a huge priority, and your most important priority for 2017 is this. Is that right? And what tends to happen there is you get a lot of nodding from your audience. And you're trying to build that momentum of nods, of yeses, as you head into your solution. So this helps you be much more effective, and it's an easy way to get started. And if there are changes or updates, they'll let you know. Okay, number 3. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but while you're pitching, you can still get them involved. So if you want them to talk, you want to ask them questions, and you want to ask them questions about them, right? It's been 4 or 5 years since I've been married, but many years ago, if I was out on the singles scene and I was meeting someone at a party or a bar, and I introduce myself and I say, hi, I'm Adam. I grew up in Maryland. I live in Los Angeles. I'm a sales consultant. What else would you like to learn about me? Probably won't help me that much, and I don't have many best practices there. But what usually makes more sense if I'm trying to engage an audience is not ask another question about me, but hi, I'm Adam. I grew up in Maryland. I now live in Los Angeles. I'm a sales consultant. Where are you from? Where do you live? What do you do? Right? So we need to think about the questions we ask if we want an engaging solution. The questions we can ask about our solution. We can say, hey, I've just shared this idea. Does it make sense? But if we want them to actually participate and talk, I would suggest, here's an idea I'm sharing. How consistent is this with your approach? How do you all think about this? Ask a question that actually invites dialogue and discussion. The fourth idea when we're presenting, I'm trying to do this today. I had some coffee earlier. Whatever you need to do, whether it's caffeine, whether it's power posing and making yourself big. If you haven't seen, one of the most popular TED Talks ever delivered is by Amy Cuddy, C-U-D-D-Y. A lot of you have probably seen it. She also came out with a book a couple years ago called Presence. Tune in to Amy Cuddy's TED Talk. She'll give you some ideas of little things you can do to improve your confidence and your assertiveness before you have to make a big presentation. The next one, if you're going to ask for something specific, we encourage that, please do so with confidence. And again, emphasize on the specificity. Too often, we get to the end of our presentation and we say thank you, which is nice, but we don't ask for anything specific. Or sometimes when we ask in a very careful or subdued way. We'll say, hey, if it's possible, could we please potentially maybe just try a test? And we don't sound that confident in what we're asking for. What I've found is very specific and simple language helps me and our team sound specific and confident. Based on what we've discussed today, here's what I'd suggest we do next. Based on what we've discussed today, here's what I'd suggest we do next. Do you have to do that? Absolutely not. But figure out your own way to present or recommend with confidence and specificity. The last one, keep your pipeline full. We got a lot of positive feedback last week. One of the points of constructive feedback is some of the examples we used last week were not as geared toward the millennial audience. So I'm not a Tinder expert. I was a little too late for the Tinder generation. But my understanding of Tinder is if I have a lot of matches, right? I got a lot of opportunities in my pipeline, I'm probably able to be a little bit more confident in the texting and the text messages that I'm communicating to any potential prospect. Well, the same thing applies to you and your business. If I have a full pipeline of opportunities, I'm not so dependent on any one opportunity. And unconsciously, I'm able to come off as much more confident in front of any specific opportunity. So the quality and the depth of our pipeline has a big impact on our ability to come off as persuasive and confident and not desperate. Hopefully that makes sense. All right. So we've covered asking the right types of questions. We've covered a few tips on solutions. Now we're going to think about when we have tough questions, concerns, resistance, how do we handle it? Now, I would be willing to bet that a lot of you have in your house right now boxes of cookies. And the boxes of cookies may very well, this time of year, have been sold to you by a young little girl in your neighborhood or maybe even your own daughter. I was on the Hermosa Beach Pier, kind of the promenade in the area where I live with my wife and our son Max, who you saw earlier, 2 Sundays ago. And my wife has one very specific rule when it comes to buying Girl Scout cookies. She is a promoter of saleswomanship. She is a promoter of female entrepreneurship. So when we receive an offer for Girl Scout cookies, if the offer comes from the Girl Scout herself, we buy cookies 100% of the time. If the offer comes from the mother or father of the Girl Scout, we do not buy the cookies. So we're on the Hermosa Beach promenade and I see them coming our way. They're pulling a wagon full of cookies. It's 2 young girls and 2 mothers. And I'm thinking to myself, I hope these girls ask so they don't get a lesson on salesmanship from my wife. And sure enough, one of the little 9-year-old perks up and says, would you like to buy some Girl Scout cookies? And because the right person asked, of course, my wife, Melissa, said, of course we will. We'll have a box of Thin Mints and we'll have a box of Samoas. And she hands them over and my wife grabs her phone and starts to get her cash. She keeps her cash in the phone and she says, oh, I'm sorry, I don't have any cash on me. An objection, resistance. And the little 9-year-old responded without any hesitation at all. She said, no problem, we take Venmo. Now, what was weird after that is Melissa actually turned to me and said, Adam, can you pay the Girl Scout's mother through your Venmo account? So I ended up paying for these, but we did, and we got the cookies. But the point here is this particular Girl Scout, I would argue, was successful in handling that point of resistance because she was cute and she was 9 years old. Now, a lot of you are cute, but I'm confident that most of you are not able to use the 9-year-old element in your approach. She was also ready with quick wit to offer Venmo. Being quick-witted can help, but it doesn't always help us in these complex resistance handling situations. We want to make sure that we are able to follow a process to work with our audience, and that's what this resistance wheel is all about. So it starts here with what you see on the screen is a trial close. Now, this is just one example of when resistance can come in, but a trial close is simply when I'm asking my audience, does this make sense? Are we on the same page? I'm checking in over the course of presenting an idea. Now, again, this is one area where resistance can come in. It can come in at a lot of different times. Example resistance that I assume most of us face if we represent products and solutions that cost money is I'm concerned about the investment, right? I'm just using a generic version that hopefully applies to most of us. So when we get someone saying to us, I'm concerned about the investment, the first thing we want to try to do is cushion. Cushion is empathy. Cushion is, I understand. I can appreciate where you're coming from. Now, the key about cushioning and providing empathy is to try your best to sound and be genuine. I could certainly say, I understand. We've heard that from other clients as well. That's not bad, but it doesn't sound that genuine. Versus actually being in their shoes. Have you ever considered investing in digital media before for your own business? That's empathy, right? If you haven't, have you ever talked to a bunch of other clients who face this decision? So genuine empathy and cushioning might sound more like, look, I appreciate you sharing that concern because frankly, I get it. This is a careful investment, and in order to drive your business in 2017, we got to get this right. Thank you again for bringing that up. Now, once they share their concern about, in this case, being concerned about the investment, could there be a lot of underlying reasons why they're concerned about the investment? They may be concerned, will it actually work? They may be concerned, should I invest with your team or should I invest with a potential competitor? When they say they're concerned about the investment, they might just not have any budget left over. And you could go on and on. There's a lot of underlying reasons that could be driving this concern. I'm concerned about the investment. So what we want to do next is a little clarifying with some good questions. And here we want to try to ask 1 or 2 or 3 open-ended questions to understand what's behind that objection. So again, in my case, if I say, hey, audience, how does this sound so far? I believe this could be a good fit for you. And they tell me, they give me the resistance at 12 o'clock. Adam, I'm a little bit concerned about the investment. And I cushion with some empathy and say, look, thank you so much for bringing that up. I get it. I mean, the necessity to make this investment in a prudent and effective way is huge for your team right now. If you could, please give me a little bit of context. When you say you're concerned about the investment, what are you thinking about? And there's a lot of different ways to ask for clarifying questions. But again, you want to get them talking more about what's driving their concern. So let's say I learn a little bit more about their concern, right? And then it's time to restate. Restatement might say, oh, okay, now I understand your concern and where you're coming from. You had invested in some AdWords solutions a couple years ago, and you didn't achieve the new customers that you had expected. Is that right? And if I've done a good job of listening and paraphrasing, I probably get them to nod and say yes. And if they're nodding and saying yes, what have I done through this cushioning and clarifying and restating process? I've put my arm around them. And instead of battling at them over their concern and trying to justify the value of my solution, I'm basically saying, let's work on this issue together. Does this work 100% of the time? Absolutely not. But does it help us win more of these opportunities? It certainly does. And where do most of us go on this little circular diagram? As soon as we get some resistance, most of us, the resistance comes in at 12 o'clock, and we're right there at 8 o'clock into that response. And even if we're totally logical and exactly right, if we're coming right back at them, we're driving that antagonistic and defensive dynamic, which usually doesn't help us. So the whole idea between cushioning, clarifying, and restating is getting our audience to a point where they're more receptive to our ideas. Okay, so I'd encourage you to take a few minutes, or a few seconds, I should say, for your own scenario. Think about, again, in one of your specific upcoming conversations later this week or sometime early next week. Think of someone, a client, a new business opportunity, can be someone internal too, who you think, we all have people sometimes at home where we get some resistance. I would encourage the professional example for this one. But write down the name of the person who is likely to give you some resistance. That should just take a couple seconds. Write that down, please. Second, write down the exact quotation. What will this person say to convey their concern? In my example, it was, Adam, we're a little bit concerned about the investment. Take 10 seconds to write down the specific quotation he or she will say to communicate their concern or resistance. In this next part, how you sound is more important than what you say, but I would ask you to take another 10 or 15 seconds and write down your example genuine cushion. I can appreciate where you're coming from. This is a very important decision. Let's think about how we can work on this. Write down your version of a cushion, please. Take 10 seconds. And once you have a cushion, I would encourage you to write down your first, ideally an open-ended clarifying question. I find using the term context, this is my way, helps me here. So I'll say to my audience, if possible, could you give me a little bit more context as to how you're thinking about this issue or this concern? Write down your version of your first, more open-ended clarifying question. Okay, so the whole idea, guys, behind heading this way into the cushioning and the clarifying is you're hopefully heading down the right path where you're working with them on the resistance rather than jumping to your instinct, which we all have, which is to respond right away. So in summary, guys, the 3 topics: we're asking better questions, a few tips on the solution, and we're handling resistance in a partner-oriented or a collaborative way. We've got a little bit of time for questions, which is why I've opened this tricks here, and I can do my best to take these one at a time. Okay. This says, do you have any suggestions on how to make your elevator speech stick? The first thing I would encourage you to ask about your elevator speech is, why do you have your elevator speech? In which context will you be using it, right? Are you going to a networking event? Are you going to a meeting with your regular contacts and maybe the CEO or someone senior will pop in for a few seconds and you want to be ready with your 20 or 30 second, what's happening and what are we talking about? So I think understanding why you have an elevator speech and what your desired outcome of that elevator speech is should drive a little bit of the content in the framework. Now, I've seen different frameworks. I mean, generally you want to be specific, but the purpose of the elevator speech is not to pitch this giant solution. The purpose of the elevator speech is usually to set up a next conversation. So you just want to intrigue enough to set up whatever next conversation or next step is appropriate. So a framework that I've seen a lot of people have success with is sharing a problem, and this can kind of come back to that insight or point of view question, right? Sharing a problem, sharing a potential idea or a solution, but the potential idea or solution is usually not a product. It's a general solution. So problem, solution, and potential impact. But again, you want to end this elevator speech, problem, solution, potential impact. You want to end it with a question. How are you thinking about that? How could this be relevant for your team? And if so, let's get some time on the calendar, or let's make sure I talk to your team about that in the future. That's how we usually see folks have the most success with elevator speeches. Okay, next. I am having trouble closing deals. Welcome to the rest of the world. Most of us have challenges there. When comparing my prices to competitors, they seem fine. Can you make any recommendations on how to better close the deal? This is a very common question. And usually, guys, what we find with regard to closing the deal is it's not, a lot of people assume that I have a 1-hour conversation and I go for the close in those last 5 minutes. What do I say at the end when I'm trying to handle resistance and set next steps and close the deal? And it's not necessarily about those last 5 minutes. It's about the 55 minutes that have already happened in those meetings. And even more so, it's about the days or weeks or hours before the meeting ever started. So we emphasize the close so much, and it's not about the close. It's about how did I prepare to be most focused on their interests personally and the objectives. It's about how do I start the meeting so that they perceive me in a credible way and use an agenda that's meaningful. It's about how do I position myself early in that meeting. How do I ask meaningful questions so that I'm perceived as genuine? How do I present simple solutions that are easy for them to execute and get started on? So I'm giving you a lot here, but in our experience, people often feel like they're having trouble at the end, closing, and it's usually comes back to earlier in the conversation or earlier in the process where we got to ask better and deeper questioning using some of the techniques we've worked on today so that the close is kind of the natural next step. It's not this big event at the end of conversations. I hope that helps. Okay, I'm scrolling down here. Have you got a few opening statements for closing and presenting the solution? That question has the word opening and closing in it. So I give you credit for asking a tough question. Have you got any opening statements for closing and presenting solution? I guess here, guys, I would reiterate the best way to transition into a solution is by reviewing what matters most to them and getting them to nod and say, you've already clearly heard and understand our objectives. So the proposal or the solution you're about to share is probably going to be well aligned to that. So the other one at the end, again, oftentimes we want this grand commitment, but we don't get the grand commitment. At the end of the meeting, we just need to commit to specific next steps. So I would suggest before I ever walk into that meeting, I want to have identified the 1, 2, or 3 most likely next steps. Now, it can change in the meeting, but usually if you say, look, after this 60-minute meeting is over, it is likely that I am going to suggest A, B, or C, or sometimes A, B, and C. And if you identify that in advance, you're much more likely to end that meeting with a, based on what we've discussed today, here's what I suggest. Let's do B. So again, guys, a lot of this comes down to the language and the confidence, but it can also tie back to some of the preparation we do in advance. There's a question here. What book describes this technique? Cushion, open-ended, clarifying questions, follow-up. I want to learn more. I appreciate your thirst for knowledge. Frankly, we've developed that based on watching people have thousands and thousands of these conversations and having them ourselves. There's a lot. There's not one book in particular where this comes from. If you buy, a colleague wrote a book called Silver Bullet Selling. So some of that will be in there. But in almost any sales book you can find, there'll be some framework for handling resistance. But again, this framework, it's about the execution of the framework. And the most important step is the diligence, or your deliberate nature of saying, I know resistance is coming. How do I handle it with them versus at them? For the conversation spectrum, what do you do if you have a client who prefers to listen more than we speak? That's reasonable. That's a common situation. I mean, there's so many variables here, right? Is this the first meeting? Is this the 21st meeting? Are there 10 people in the client audience? Is there 1 person in the client audience? So there's a lot of variables in here. I mean, again, we say we have better questions or we have better conversations when we've moved to the right there. But often we need to build credibility. To your point, we do need to do some talking earlier in the conversation to get them to open up. So again, depending on the dynamics of the conversation, I might propose using an agenda, right? So and this is simple, and we have agendas in a lot of meetings, whether your agenda is oral, whether you write it on a whiteboard in the actual meeting room, or whether you have it on a slide or a physical piece of paper. But if the agenda actually says, we're going to give a brief overview of who we are and what we do and how we work with clients, then we'd love to spend some time learning about your business, your primary objectives, what you're trying to accomplish in 2017. Then later in this discussion, we'll share some initial ideas, or we'll do some brainstorming together on how to work together. If you've laid out that dynamic in advance and they've agreed to the agenda, you've kind of set the expectation that we're going to do a little talking up front, then we're going to be doing some question asking and learning about you, then we'll discuss ideas on how we may be able to work together. So it happens, and there's times in certain meetings where it is appropriate for us to do more of the talking. But in my experience, when we've set the expectation in advance and they understand that answering our questions will ultimately help them, we're tend to able to drive more of that dynamic to get them talking a little bit more. A lot of questions this time. A similar question here. When trying to dig deeper with clients, how do you respond if they are reserved or unwilling to give you meaningful responses? Again, I think this comes back a little bit to some of that Jerry Maguire, Rod Tidwell conversation. Either you need to build more credibility up front so that they believe if they answer your questions that you will be able to help them, and they'll open up if they believe they're speaking to a trusted potential partner. Or again, back to that help me help you. It's okay to be very intentional about why you're asking the questions you're asking. So if you say to someone, look, we'd love to spend the next 15 minutes really learning about your business, your priorities, because frankly, we have a lot of solutions and a lot of ideas. We want to share the ones that will be helpful and appropriate for you. And we don't want to waste your time on the ones that are less relevant. So we'd love to spend a little bit of time next learning about your business and some of your specific priorities so that we can potentially support you best. Is that okay? It doesn't work all the time, but often if they understand why we're asking what we're asking, we can be a little bit more effective there. This is an interesting, what type of question, current, desired, or expectation is the most impactful for client situations or for client conversations? It's not about one specific type of question. It's about the process. So desired situation questions don't work without current situation questions, and vice versa. And the expectations questions help us understand how they want to be served. So the idea is it's not about one type of question. It's about using a framework to prepare more efficiently so we can have a more intentional dialogue and guide the conversation in a way that's, of course, productive for us, but most importantly, productive and helpful to our audience. Okay, now I'm getting a note. Please wrap up. So guys, if you haven't seen it, my email address is on the bottom of this slide here. You're more than welcome to follow up with me with any questions. In closing, I will ask you to think of this guy. Most of you, whether you're a sports fan or not, you know him. Unfortunately, Muhammad Ali passed away last year. Now, Muhammad Ali's nickname was the greatest. And the cool thing about that nickname is, you know who gave him that nickname? It was self-proclaimed. He gave it to himself. And then he changed his nickname. He wasn't the greatest, but he was the double greatest. And he told people he was the double greatest. Now, you see Muhammad Ali here doing sit-ups. He was in a little better shape than I am. When I do my sit-ups, I start counting at 1 and 2 and 3, and off I go. Right? And I don't do that many. But Muhammad Ali said, I don't count my sit-ups. I only start counting when it starts hurting, because those are the ones that count. And you are now at a situation with the topics we've covered today, slightly more impactful questions, presenting tips on stickier solutions, and handling resistance with our audience versus at our audience, that it now is starting to count. It's time to put this stuff into action. And I can tell you, I really appreciate you guys tuning in and spending the time to listen to these ideas. And I look forward to hearing about your huge success actually implementing it with your audiences. Thank you.